Welcome to the Tabletop Gaming Guild podcast, a podcast all about the experiences and memories that board games with friends and family can create. On today's episode, we're going to discuss RPGs that aren't Dungeons & Dragons.
But we will talk about Dungeons & Dragons, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We have to talk about Dungeons & Dragons just to have a comparison point.
Yeah. It's that dragon in the room.
So before James derails us, I wanted to cover a sort of high-level overview. Back in the hinterlands days, I used to run RPG tabletop design with children. One of the things that we instructed them with was most, if not all, tabletop RPG games need three things to function properly. And these three things are sort of systems of rules or what have you. One piece is character generation. Another piece is task resolution. How do you determine whether or not a character succeeds or fails at something that they're attempting to do at which they could succeed or fail at? And the third piece is basically combat resolution, or painted in broader strokes, scene resolution. You need to tie individual actions together in order to finish or complete a scene. Most frequently, the most mechanical piece of a game is combat, but often the mechanical pieces of an RPG can get clunky when doing like a race, a sporting event, or any other kind of contest extended through time. All right, James, derail us.
Actually, before we get to that, there should be a disclaimer. I think Dan and Peter definitely are experts in this topic. I can say, I have little actual experience, but I've watched a lot of content and I've heard a lot about these. So I'll be talking about like things that I've heard about that sound cool. And it's like, okay, that apply to the topic.
All right. So yeah, my disclaimer is I'm not the greatest RPG fan in the world. I am not really super in depth in it. I will play it. I will enjoy it, but just keep in mind, I'm not at the level on there. So when I'm going to go through this, it doesn't mean that I hate anything that's going to be in here. I am just going to be nitpicky, and for topics of discussion, I am going to try to shred some stuff in some of the RPGs and maybe go over some I think that do it better or worse. But basically, that's what I want to talk about. So the first thing I want to talk about is D&D in general. D&D is, no matter what you say, cultural phenomenon. It is embedded in many of our pop culture. It's been around for a while. And when people think RPGs, in general, I would say that almost everyone will think D&D. So when it comes to people deciding what RPG to play, the first thing that probably comes to mind all the time is D&D. D&D has gone through multiple generations and has lots of changes. Some people get fixated on certain editions, some people don't. But overall, my first impression of all the different editions of D&D is the core idea of all is stayed the same. So whether it's first edition or fifth ed, the core of D&D is still there. The idea of a complicated system of leveling up with multiple different abilities you can get that grew over time is still there. The idea of the same generic, which D&D made them generic because it popularized them, but of classes and monsters and stuff is all there. Now, how you get there might be a little different from first edition to fifth ed, but in general, it's the same. What do you guys think?
I would agree from I know that Nathan has said that I'm an expert here, but again, I've been playing only 5th edition. So I've been playing RPGs probably recently more than the other guys, but I was introduced to RPGs only when I was 30. I'm 36 now, so I've been playing D&D for 6 years, as well as a couple of our other RPGs now. But from my time getting to know the game, getting to know the history of the game, I would have to agree with your assessment, James, that the core of the game is still basically the same. The function with how they get to that, like all the combat, the mechanics, those things change. But the core of the game, it is what most people know of as RPGs, whether it's now in video games, such as Skyrim, or something along those lines. It is the fact that you create a character, you start level 1, you go out in the world and you kill a bunch of monsters and you do a bunch of tasks and you gain levels and you grow your skills. Same thing, the video game, as with Dungeons and Dragons or other RPGs, that core set is there. But again, it with each edition they will change things. I've most recently been hearing talk about fourth edition, which was one of the it was kind of a short-lived edition of D&D, but it went kind of more video game combat style, is my understanding from what I've heard people talk about. And some people say that that was one of the reasons why it was so short-lived, but I've heard some people who love it, some people who hate it. But again, the essence of the game is the fantasy of having powers, killing monsters, and again, I'm one of those people like, that's about all I need. I'm good to go. I get to make up a fun story, and I'm definitely somebody who enjoys more than combat. I enjoy the role playing aspect, talking in character. Don't have to do voices, but trying to get into the head of the character and having those conversations with other characters, to me, is so much fun. But I'm with you, James. I do think the core of the game is still there.
I think a lot of things that have to do with 5th ed and other versions of D&D doing so well is third-party support and third-party skins over the game. So basically changing it to a sci-fi, or changing it to Lord of the Rings, or changing it to just about anything you think of, also helped out with it a lot.
Yeah, I'm assuming there was some of that with the earlier editions. It is definitely a big part of 5th edition. There are so many different companies out there right now that are making the third-party content. They've got the DMs Guild, which is like semi-officially whatever, with Dungeons and Dragons like associated there. But I mean, there's a whole website just for everybody to put their stuff that fits in the open game license, and they sell. I mean, my understanding is it's definitely not the largest part of the market, but it's still a pretty decent size portion of the market that people go to buy their 5th edition stuff. And I mean, it's just, I can't even think of all the companies that's a big part of their model, is to do those skins for 5th edition.
I'm going to agree with what was said right there, both your original comment. So yeah, D&D since 1st edition, it's always been fantasy genre. The character creation has always been pick a race, pick a class. The very 1st edition, they were sort of the same thing, because dwarf was a class. And then the contest resolution was almost always roll D20 and do something with it, right? And in terms of the explosion of related content for that system, I think that started with 3rd edition, and the D20 license was the first opportunity that people had to like effectively print their own material for D&D and have it be legit. But yeah, that continues to be explosive. It's been probably more than a year now since I've looked at the actual numbers, but as far as I'm aware, in terms of industry, D&D is Dungeons and Dragons. That license is the top seller among tabletop RPGs. And then it goes down from there. Pathfinder, I think, is a close second, but like if you sum totaled all the third-party content for Dungeons and Dragons, it might get close to or exceed Pathfinder, which is number 2. So that's how big it is.
Yeah, D&D definitely is the largest in there. So I'm going to get into a couple of things. Like, one of the things is trying to figure out why it's the largest, because overall the system is still the system. It hasn't changed all that much. I mean, from 1st to 5th, sure, but between each edition, it hasn't changed a ton. So when you have other RPGs there that are more inventive and do different things, you would think that they would hit a chord. Like, some of the things that people may or may not like with D&D is the overly complicated ability and magic system, where there's a lot to it. And companies like Monty Cook Games went a different approach. So through a lot of their RPGs, players can basically invent their own magic, and then they fit it within their level. So they don't have to be like, I'm only going to learn magic missile and I'm limited to this. They actually pick, like, I can do electrical stuff, so I can fire lightning, and that's my thing. So I invent my own stuff from it, but the core is simplified where it is based on the level that you are in the game. So you can get into a more narrative experience with those RPGs than you can with D&D, because you're not bogged down by, okay, let's level everyone up. Let's go ahead and pick what spell slots you want to use and all that fun stuff. So do you think that more most people want to spend a lot of time being analyzing what spells they get? Or is that just a product of, I want to play D&D, I've read all the books, I'm just going to go into it? What do you think? Like when you're playing it, do most people want to say, okay, I'm going to spend a couple hours to figure out how to best maximize my character?
I think one of the things that D&D has going for it is that it is accessible. I mean, to create a character, you effectively pick a race, pick a class, and then you might have to pick a couple other things based on what level you're making your character at, right? Because, sometimes if you're creating a character at a high level, you have to pick, A or B in terms of like, the power set that you have or what have you. Obviously, if you're picking a spellcaster, you need to pick out what your favorite spells are, or what your known spells are, depending upon the class that you pick.
I think an important element of why it's so successful is the sheer amount of content that they're constantly adding without being detrimental to the base game. The base game is still accessible. You can play perfectly fine with just the base game. But for the hardcore fans who want to play all the time, there's always something new. Just like the CCGs, that's how they get the people to continue, by constantly doing booster packs. But the problem with CCGs is unless you keep buying the booster packs, you can't keep up with experienced players. That's not a problem that D&D has. You can always just play the base game.
The real question is the rigid system that it has for spells and abilities that you can gain throughout the game a bonus for most people? Like, are most people looking like perusing through that and trying to figure out what's the best, or they're just figuring out whatever sounds good and putting it in there? Basically, is that system taking away from the enjoyment of the game? Not that it's like destroying the game or anything. It's just like, if it wasn't as complicated, or if it didn't have as many options, would it make the experience of D&D better? So it's not that it's bad. It's just that, is it too much? Would pulling that back a little bit, like what they did with some of the Monte Cook games, help the game, help D&D out?
I think it depends on the players involved, because certain players want flexibility, which D&D is not going to provide as much, and other players are going to want precision, which D&D can provide, because it's like every ability is predefined. You just kind of have to pick them.
Right. And you have a structure with D&D that you can rely on through its rule system. Things are a certain way. Not that you're necessarily going to rules lawyer it too much, but you can figure out what exactly you want to do based on all the variables that are available out there. And you can make pretty unique things, but you have a structured system where you know how this works, you know how that works. There's not like any unknown necessarily, other than what the DM may put in thematically when they're doing their session. There's nothing like, you can know how every monster functions, how every ability functions, how every magic thing functions, and technically they would follow that. So some people, they would like that, and I agree. It's just, I think some people would like, obviously some people do like having less and having some unknown and having some more flexibility on the player side to tell their story.
Yeah.
The argument I've heard for that is, you're a new player, you can always play a barbarian. You just smack things. You don't have to worry too much. Of course, that means like, yes, there still makes certain classes a little bit intimidating. So you kind of felt like, I need to play the simple class. I can't be a wizard the first time I'm playing.
Well, barbarian has a lot of stuff too.
Yeah, true, but not nearly as much as wizard, I think.
But go ahead, Peter. You were going to say
something. I know what you're saying. I don't believe that it would make Dungeons and Dragons better to scale it back. And I say it just because that's why we have other games. There are games out there for the people who want maybe a little less complexity, or they want to focus really on story and less on mechanics. Those games are out there. And so if you're asking, could it make it better? I guess the answer might be maybe, but does it need to? No, because they've obviously got a market for the game they're making now. Why change this game? I think to meet another subset of the market that is currently not really all that interested. It's like, well, then are we creating a whole new game and just calling it Dungeons and Dragons just so it fits and grabs this one side of the market, or we just let that side of the market find the game that fits them? And I think that that's a good thing, because D&D is big enough as it is. It doesn't need to get any bigger. I think there always needs to be room for the other games out there.
I think D&D can get bigger because it's it's still a minority game. Very few
I know
people
it can.
play it. And to be fair, I'm not picking completely on D&D. D&D is the bar. So when we do any discussion, and my discussion is going to be against that bar. He said that there's other games out there that they could go to, but here's the other problem that I'm going to throw out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where third-party stuff does maybe even better than D&D sometimes in general for D&D, is because it is an investment, a time investment to learn an RPG. And what comes with it is it's a community game. So a group of people have to take that time investment to learn the game. And the problem can come where if a group of people are going to invest their time to learn an RPG, they're going to learn probably D&D. So they're going to be less likely to jump to other RPGs in general because of that time investment and getting other people to play it. Now, I'm not saying that D&D has to change to do that. I think the third-party products, the reason why they do so well is because they actually do change. Some of them do change D&D pretty drastically to fit that. So some of them drop all the abilities in the magic system and make their own and have the core of D&D for the checks and stuff. I do personally think that because it's a behemoth and because RPGs are such a big investment, that D&D actually hurts not just in what it has, but its existence hurts other RPGs from starting that may be better. I don't know. What do you think of that?
I don't think that Dungeons & Dragons is such megalith. No game can be all things to all players. We know this. We absolutely know this. So I think there's a niche. It might not be as big as D&D, but there's a space out there for games that aren't D&D because they exist. Some of them have been around for years. A few of them have been around for almost as long as Dungeons and Dragons. Shadowrun's a very old game. It's on like its 7th edition. 7th.
People still play that Vampire Masquerade. The question is that D&D players, with the amount of content they've learned and the amount of content they have done, do you think they're likely at all in general for the majority of them to try a different RPG that's what I'm getting into, because of the amount they have to learn and the amount of work they have to do to get a group to play this other RPG?
Okay. I mean, I guess probably. I'm not seeing any kind of research out there on this or not, but I would say probably the majority of people who play D&D just play D&D. I would agree with that assumption, with knowing it is just an assumption because we don't have any research. The majority of people that I have played D&D with, I've only ever played D&D with them. I have not all of a sudden played another game. Now, some of these guys I have. Some of them are like, oh no, I want to play one of the fantasy age or modern age systems, and they play one of those games, but they don't play it as consistently as they do D&D. So there's definitely a portion of the D&D players and dungeon masters or game masters who will dip their toes into other games for at least a period of time. I've not seen them stick with those games for very long before going back to D&D. I mean, again, that I'm one of those people. I have played a little bit of other games, but because the majority of people that I know who play D&D, it's easier to go back to that game. And I get what you're saying. Well, maybe that's detrimental, that we're so stuck on this one game that we're not experiencing the vast majority of games that are out there. And I would agree that that's probably not a great thing for the players, because I think that, the more you play, the more different things you experience, you have more opportunity to grow as a player, as somebody who runs games, as just somebody who plays games in general. It's the same thing with board games. You don't want to just play Euro games only forever and always. We all
if you're
play,
James, you do.
If you're James, you do. But there's other styles of games out there to play, and so the more I have gotten into playing role-playing games, the more I do want to spread out and play other types and play other genres. So I'm looking forward to doing that more in the future. But I don't know. It might just continue to be easier for me to just put a group together who wants to play D&D because that's what they know. And so I think the assumption in the question is probably correct. And again, it makes me really happy to know that there are a ton of people out there making other games in the role-playing world. It's just not nearly as many people are playing those games.
One thing I've heard a lot that goes along with what Peter's saying is the concept of taking a break from D&D. So it's like the people that play on a weekly basis, occasionally, they finish an arc. They want to go into a different theme or, do sci-fi for a little bit. So they might do a one-shot of something else. And usually that ends up being just a one-shot or a short campaign. And then they go right back to D&D from things I've heard.
Yeah, I have a couple friends that are currently jumping out of D&D to play other things for a little bit. Because, D&D, it is the same. The DM is responsible to make it interesting. So at a certain point, you might be like, I've killed enough goblins. I'd like to kill space aliens. So we'll do that for a little bit. Sure. That's great. That means they're embracing the hobby of RPG games and they're trying to branch out and find new systems. So I'm doing a drop in the bucket thing. So the next thing is, I was giving the premise that D&D is probably the default. Most people know it. It's probably the one that most people know. When people go to other things, they go back to that because the majority of people that play RPGs know D&D. So that gets into other RPGs. So if you're making a different RPG, I found that through Kickstarter and looking at the different ones, a lot of them are similar to D&D, even if they don't use the same system. So they're trying that, this is a new system with this fancy thing, but in general, they're trying to ease them in there. It seems like with the same sort of idea. And Free League Games, the Symborium is sort of in that area. It doesn't have much for the magic system or anything like that stuff. It simplified it down and made it more into storytelling, but the checks and stuff are similar. They did the reverse. You have to get below a number instead of above a number sort of idea. And they did a couple different things, but in general, in fact, they have a Kickstarter for it to be 5th ed. The writer that definitely took cues off of D&D when they made their RPG, or it seems like they did, to make it easier for people to jump into it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But do you think that it's going to be a while before people can and some of them actually are drastically different, but I'm not sure that they do very well. Do you think it'll be a while before a completely unique RPG system is very popular? Because even some of your Vampire the Masquerade and other ones, like your werewolf ones are sort of similar to, you could tell they're from 1st or 2nd edition D&D-ish. They're not too different, like the Star Wars RPG and stuff. It's not drastically different.
Part of this is history, because it's Dungeons and Dragons really was the first tabletop RPG, really, or close to it. I'm going to disagree that the White Wolf storytelling system is really anything like D&D. It's much more story intensive. The character creation, you pick a clan, right? Or faction in most
clan, faction, moon thing,
yeah, school or tradition in Mage. They've got different names for the different supernatural creatures that exist in that universe. You don't really pick a race because everyone's human, more or less. There's usually some other feature in character generation. But you get a certain number of points, you buy stats, skills, backgrounds with those points during character generation. And then there's different points that you earn as experience during play to buy those same things, but they're two completely different scales, which never made too much sense to me, but whatever. But the task resolution mechanic is totally different because you have a dice pool in the White Wolf storytelling system. If your strength is, or you're trying to solve a puzzle and the GM tells you, roll wits plus enigmas, and your wits is 2 and your enigmas is 1. You're only rolling 3 dice, right? And then the GM mentally sets a difficulty, and these are 10-sided dice. So every die you roll over whatever the GM sets the difficulty counts as success, and most tasks just need 1 or 2 successes.
Yeah, it's sort of like a complicated skill check, like in D&D, but I think it's closer to Mansions of Madness was also sort of how many successes did you get, except for you didn't have to roll the dang dice to get a number to get a success to figure it out. But yeah.
And then combat in that system is completely different because it's been a while since I played that system, but I think it's a margin of success system where basically, the attacker rolls dice and scores success. The defender rolls dice and scores success. And then any damage that is dealt is is taken off your health sheet. But because the dice pool for your damage is compared against the defender's armor, you usually only score a couple points of damage in a single attack, no matter how lethal the weapon is that you're using, though more lethal weapons will have larger dice pools, because there isn't a lot of health in that game. No. You have 7 health levels if you're like a human, 6 or 7, something like that. And if you take all 7 of those health levels, you're KO'd.
Yeah, it seemed like in that system they just divided it by 10. So like instead of 70 health, you have 7. Like, okay, it works out really well. It's actually harder to die, I think, in the White Wolf games than it is in D&D, or at least you flat-footed.
I think so too. At lower levels of D&D, right?
I guess it depends on the DM.
High level D&D, you have so many hit points.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But yeah, low level, it's easy to get taken out. Yeah, I missed playing White Wolf. That was fun. I played that and Vampire the Masquerade, and I played D&D First Edition and Star Wars, the RPG.
Which Star
D6,
Wars did you play?
The D6.
So that's the West End Games version, probably.
It's the one that you have in the box in the back of NDC.
That's the West End Games version.
That was definitely it, where you had to calculate fuel and stuff. It's like, I'm running out of fuel. Why do I have to keep buying fuel? Can't go across the dang galaxy without money.
As long as we're talking about non-D&D games, can I go to rant about old games? Because there were some really bad old games, like in the 80s.
Oh, there's hundreds. Like that was an explosion. Everyone was trying to compete with D&D.
I mean, some of them have become timeless classics now. Like there was a Marvel RPG where character stats were rated as human, and then superhuman, and then superhuman, and then near the end of the scale it was shift X, Y, and Z. That was like galactic scale, really.
Yeah.
And then there was a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles system that was actually pretty decent. Like the character generation of that system was amazing because you either rolled a chart or picked what animal you're mutant from or mutated into, depending, and like that sort of helped determine like your power set. Really interesting stuff. And
I'm trying to remember the game. I played a RPG when I was a kid that you were dead and you lived in the afterlife, and everything had a mirror, and one thing you can do is you can change people into objects. So I remember that I overcome my friend and I turned him into a brick and I placed him into the wall because people become furniture or other things you need. But I'm trying to remember the name of the RPG. That was a really horrible RPG, but I had a lot of fun with it. I got to remember the name. Keep on going. I'll figure it out.
I'll mention one more bad game from the 80s before we move on. My favorite memory, I actually loved this system when I was a kid, was the Hero Engine, and it was published by ICE. And this was a superhero genre game that was extremely math heavy. Right. So like you had 6 to 8 different stats. It was a character point driven engine. Right. So you got a certain base level number of character points. If you wanted any extra, you would have to basically purchase the disadvantages for your character to build up a pool with which to buy stats, skills, powers, etc., etc., etc. But like the 8 different stats, and there were like 4 or 5 calculated stats, and like they all had different point values on all of them, and the power system was extremely detailed but extremely complicated because you could take a power and you could modify it with things that could modify powers. I don't even know what they were called, but these things would apply basically a multiplier or a divider onto the character point cost of your power based on whether or not they provided an advantage or disadvantage. Horribly complicated, tons of math. The most detailed character generation system I have ever seen to date, though, because if you wanted to play a superhero, any superhero at all, you could probably build it with that system.
That gets into one thing that I wanted to throw out there real quick. Sort of in D&D, you can think of it as you're playing as a superhero. You're gaining abilities and stuff throughout the game, but the characters themselves are above everything else. So that character could go in and maybe take out 10 goblins. That character can learn high level spells eventually and become super powerful. And I know D&D has a system where you raise the level of the monsters and stuff as you go through. But in general, I think that when people are playing D&D games, it's to be that hero, to be that superpower. It's like in the Lord of the Rings books where Legolas isn't a regular warrior. He's a superhero. He can run through and kill billions of people, fire an arrow from behind his back, and go through 10 goblins. And do you think that that's what D&D emulates? Is basically your ability to be a hero, but your ability to be a superhero?
So different games definitely have a different like feel to them. I think that's where D&D wants to end up. I haven't played too much 5th edition, but in 2nd, 3rd edition, absolutely high level characters, because the magic items that they would have on their person could be superhero level characters. Like they could fly and do all sorts of other weird stuff, have girdles of giant strength. They literally be Superman. And I think the fantasy genre itself is often a little bit of a power fantasy, right?
Yeah, and that's not that necessarily a bad thing. But what I was getting at was I like the idea of having like a super powerful character, but I also like, and I think this is where I like other games like Symbaroum a little bit more. And that's because in that game and a lot of other games, you're not that powerful. You can run into a single goblin and just immediately die if you attack it, or different monsters. So it gets into more of like, you're not going to go in there and blast the room out. You actually have to do some thought. Not that you don't have to do thought in D&D, but you actually have to negotiate. You actually have to avoid. You actually have to strategize your attack. You can't just jump in there and do a super dive in there and take out the bad guy. And not that D&D is bad or anything, and not that that's a cool thing, but I also really like that what I think it's failing in is the horror aspect where you are afraid. You're not necessarily going to be the one that can run in. You're going to see these monsters and you're going to know that you just can't take them. So you have to make a decision on there. Your character might die at that point. So there's more to be lost on there, I think. I don't know if you know what I'm getting at, but basically like when you're exploring, there's a little bit more fear in those type of systems, because if you're not careful, there's no way out of being able to survive. If you run into a horde of ghouls, you're not going to take them out. They're going to kill you. So you have to do more recon. You have to be more careful. You have to be more crafty. So it's instead of geared to like having a party where you're going to have like one person rogue sneaking out, the whole party itself is going to be more cautious and look more at their environment. It's a more descriptive game because it gets more into what's around you, and you have to go slowly through areas. You have to ask about details. You have to look at different things. You don't go from point A to point B. You have to take that dangerous journey between point A and point B on the lookout all the time. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily better or anything. I just like that. I like that. I think that systems like that the feeling of dread or being scared of something stronger than in a D&D game. I don't know if you guys know what I'm getting at or agree or anything, but basically
I think you're touching on tone, the emotional quality behind the game, right? Not that D&D can't do other tones than like superpowers over the top, right? It can be gritty, realistic. They did Dark Sun back in the day, right? And they at some points, Chaosium, I think, which is the company that does Call of Cthulhu, did release a D20 version of Cthulhu. So you can run Cthulhu monsters in your Dungeons and Dragons campaign, which, by the way, was a big problem for people who weren't familiar with Cthulhu, playing Cthulhu using the D20 rules system, because they thought that when they encountered the monster, they could fight it. No, folks. If you encounter a monster in the Cthulhu system, you run. I mean, if you find magic, you don't read it unless it's absolutely necessary, because reading magic is a great way for you to go insane.
Or open a refrigerator.
Yeah. And then there's that space, and the dog says, well, "Oh wait, no, that's Ghostbusters."
I think what he's getting at is more like the idea that in high-level D&D, there's an impermanence to death. You can always resurrect, and there seems like penalty for doing something dumb is not there, which my understanding is that's a lot of why OSR games exist. Probably oversimplifying this, but the old school revolution, a lot of that is to get to the idea of there's a penalty for dying. Death is something to be afraid of. And, Morkborg is one of those from Free League Press. It's intended to be a brutal game where you could die, and you could die painfully.
Yeah, even Aliens is one shots mainly. You probably won't live, but you might. And I like that a lot. I really like, I like playing D&D for what it is. And I also like playing a game where I'm on edge. Like don't have all the answers. My team can't save me. We have to think this through. We have to be super careful. If we run into an alien or we run into a horde of goblins, we got to go. And we got to figure out who we're going to hamstring to be eaten while we run away. No, I'm kidding. I sort of like that. I think that is a nice area that's off of D&D that's not necessarily directly tied to it. Like, I think the percentile system with the regular Cthulhu system through Chaosium works a lot better than the D20 system does. So I think that's an area that I think that those can live in and do better. If that's what you like. So that's just my general thoughts on there. I don't really think that the baseline system unmodified by a lot could do those effectively, but it's not trying to either. It is what it is. I don't know if that makes sense, Peter. It's just a different, I think it's a different subset that can exist. That's great. And there's a lot of RPGs that do it amazingly. That is a good diversion from playing D&D that I think people should try if they're into that sort of thing.
Now, this could be a false conception, but it kind of plays into what he's saying. It does seem like D&D favors people playing as neutral or good characters. I know you can play as an evil character, but just doesn't seem to happen as much. And I know there's some systems that definitely favor the evil side. And is that a false conception? Would you agree to that? Or
I mean, the whole alignment system in Dungeons and Dragons is sort of something of its own design. It's supposed to be a guide for how to role play your character, really. And they used to incorporate your alignment into the mechanisms of the game. It used to be the thing that only, like, paladins were only lawful good, which I don't think is the case anymore in 5th edition, right, Pete?
That's correct. They don't have to be lawful good.
But yeah, that was just like a guide to the player for how to role play their character. A lot of games cast the players as heroic people. They want to make the players feel like they are the good guys. A lot of games, however, cast the players as simply protagonists in the story. And at that point, that's when players can be shades of gray, or they can be like anti-heroes. Shadowrun is a pretty good example. The players are simply these agents hired by various entities, mostly for money, right? To eke out their living in the grand scheme of things. But like, those Shadowrunners are operating against the law and off the grid, often for very suspicious projects. So
a pure evil group is going to be really hard to run anyway too, in any system, because technically if you're going to play as an evil character, camaraderie or working as a group is odd.
Yeah, that's why you got like silly games like Goblin Quest, which has actually been altered into, there's Sean Bean Quest. That's kind of the same concept that they've taken. But in Goblin Quest, you are just like a horde of goblins and you're expected to die like quickly, and you just reincarnate as another goblin. So you can play evil and, do all these awful things. And yes, you're probably going to die, but that's fine. You're just a new character.
Peter hasn't been able to talk very much. So
no, I just, I don't want to take over the conversation. I want to hear what you all have to say about things.
While we're talking about death, can I talk about Paranoia? Paranoia's got some of the best character death ever.
Paranoia is high on my list of games I would love to play. I don't want to run it. I want to play. I've seen it.
That's fair.
I've seen it run before. I've seen it played before. So as soon as somebody says I'm going to run Paranoia, I will be at the table to play because it looks fun.
So in Paranoia, the players exist in a post-apocalyptic, I think, dystopian society in which they live in a like domed or underground complex run by a computer AI who insists that all citizens are loyal, and treason is punishable by death. And some of the ways that you could be treasonous is you can have a mutant power. By the way, all player characters have a mutant power. You can belong to a secret society. Oh, by the way, all player characters belong to a secret society. And the player characters are all cast as troubleshooters. So they are the people that the computer is sending out to fix problems. And the game has a great way to deal with character death because it happens frequently. You start by naming your character, and your character's name ends with a number, usually the number 1 to start with. And when your character dies, You just cross out the 1 or erase it and change it to a 2, and you're the next member of your family's clone line. So you just playing the clone of your old family, and we assume that your memories are uploaded in some, like, I don't know, Arnold Schwarzenegger film-esque way.
That sounds really cool.
Yes, I want to play this game. Like I said, I've watched a group stream it live, playing a session of it, and I fell in love with the idea of playing it. But again, it's not pejorative, but the forever GM, the person who always runs the games. I don't want to be that person. I mean, I want to run because I love running games, but I also really love playing as a character. And so that's one of the games that I've seen the book in the store, and I'm like, I could get it, and I could probably talk some people into playing it, but I really just would rather play it myself.
Yep. So I don't think this has enough controversy right now, so I'm going to throw a piece of controversy in.
Sure.
I don't think that Pathfinder is a different game from D&D. I think that its branching from 3rd edition kept the essence of D&D and just renamed things. Arguments.
Well, see, what you should have done was you should have invited somebody on here who plays Pathfinder.
I played Pathfinder a bit. It does have some slight changes to it, but it's really 3rd edition, and the new version's closer to 5th edition.
Well, I was going to say my understanding of the history of Pathfinder is that it branched off of 3.5.
No, that's true. Sorry, 3.5.
Yeah.
Yes, it did branch off of 3.5.
So it branched off of 3.5. And that is the extent of my knowledge of Pathfinder. I've never played it. I've seen lots of people play it. I have also heard that there's some controversy when you tell people that it's not a different game than D&D. I know that Pathfinder is now into its 2nd edition.
Right, which is closer to 5th edition.
I was going to say the 2nd edition. I have no idea how much different that made it from the original Pathfinder.
Not a whole bunch.
Okay, so I don't know. I know you're looking for some controversy here. I think you just got the wrong crowd.
Yeah, I did.
Maybe the people listening right now are yelling at you, James.
We just lost all of our fans in Ireland.
So everybody listening to the podcast right now, in the comments on like the YouTube version or somewhere, yell at James right now.
I want to hear it. I want to hear it. I honestly do. I played Pathfinder a bit. It does have a completely different story. It does have a completely different like classes sort of idea and stuff, but the core, I think, is the same. Like, it's not different. You're still doing skill check. In fact,
well, I mean, it's still in it. My understanding, it's still in its essence a fantasy role playing game where you play superpowered people. I mean, like, you level up.
Yeah.
It's still very, very similar. And so that's why I think, like, when you talk about most fantasy games in the RPG world that do that, I think where you really start to find different games that are trying to do things drastically different from D&D are a lot of the non-campaign-esque role-playing games. There are role-playing games out there that are, here is a very specific thing. It's probably really built around a one-shot, maybe a couple sessions possibly. But as soon as you get into a game that is running, you're level 1, now you're level 2, now you're level 3, and you're growing, you bleed into that generic role-playing game.
Oh, you're going to make me get in trouble because I'm going to just say it's a verbatim carbon copy.
Well, I mean, and I'm not, I mean, it's what role-playing games are to a lot of people. So that's what I'm saying. So I feel like there's a lot more wiggle room to just come up with something new and it feel new when it's a smaller game or it's a one shot or just a couple sessions. Because all of a sudden you're not worrying about a character that's going to level up, that's going to become a hero one day, but you're just trying to tell a story. An example of that is it's what's considered to be called like a pamphlet game or whatever, but it's just on maybe like two sides of a piece of paper, or maybe it's literally a pamphlet that you print out and you fold it threefold style. But there's one called the Journey to the Whispering Tree that is put out there. The author's name is Jamila, and they are on Twitter at Temporal Hiccup, and it's a really interesting game where you are playing as an individual who has like a mission. You have something in you that is maybe it's a secret or you have a desire, and your goal is to travel into the wood to find this one tree that is known as the Whispering Tree, where you can whisper your dream to it and possibly receive your wish. but it's the journey there. And again, it's a 1, maybe 2 session story, but it's very story driven. And it's not about, okay, I'm going to take this character and I'm going to play for weeks or months or years and level up and gain abilities, but it is still a role-playing game. And at no point in time playing this game did I feel like I was playing D&D, like I was feel like I was playing anything other than the game I was playing at the time. And so I feel like you do get I have yet to play a game that was campaign style that I didn't feel like was just another role-playing game that felt a lot like Dungeons and Dragons. And again, maybe that's not fair, but with it being one of the original kind of game, I feel like everything sits on its shoulders in a way. So it's really nice, I think, to try to dip your toes into some of these other smaller games that are not campaign style, because I feel like there's a lot more room for a different feel, I guess.
I don't know. I think I agree, and I throw in this disagree. I think that you can have a campaign style system and not level up.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah. I haven't played one yet.
There's a couple.
I just haven't played one yet, but yeah, so.
I think next week we're going to do Symbarium, hopefully.
Okay.
As long as I don't chicken out, because it's my first DM game.
You're not going to chicken out. We won't let you.
Oh, they won't let me, but I think you're going to really like it. It could be run multiple different ways. It's depending on how you play, will depend on how it progresses. So it'll be interesting. I will let you know that you need to be more observant in Symbarium than potentially a D&D game. But I just want to throw this out because this is a game where this is a podcast where I'm just going to have everyone just yell at me. So I'm going to throw out something, and it doesn't matter if I agree or disagree with what I'm going to say. I'm just going to do it. So in D&D as a thought. So if you're thinking about it, in the average D&D game, are the people playing really heroes? If you think about what the session is and what the objectives are in an average D&D, like an Adventure League D&D, where you're just doing one session that's like a one-off or whatever, and it doesn't have to be connected to a campaign per se, are they acting in the way of a hero, or are they acting in the way of a mercenary or potentially a thug?
One of those, yeah.
So you can have a cool campaign where you have like a moral backdrop to it, but, and this is for controversy's sake, but in an average game, if you really look down into it, what are those people doing? They're going out, there could be one where they're trying to save someone, sure, but a lot of them are they're going to get treasure. They're going to do a mission where they're going to slay a dragon. Why? Because they just want it dead. And they're driven by money, which I understand that in the idea of it, that you need to have the money to continue on. But I need that gold reward to do X. For all the ones I've ever played, you're going to go out there to get the rewards. You're not going out there just to do it. I don't know. So what do you think of that, Peter? Let people attack me in the comments. It's fine. But what do you think?
No, I mean, I think it depends on the players. I think it depends on the characters that they've created. I've played in games where, yes, every single session is we're being asked to do something, and our response is, okay, great. How much are you paying? Oh, you're not paying anything. Nah, we're good.
Yeah.
No, I mean it's a style of play. It's a decision to make, I think, as players and as characters. And I think it's really fun when you have differing motivations in characters. So you'll have the party where the majority of the party just wants to get paid. And then there's the one person who is, no, we should just do this thing because it's a good thing and it's the right thing to do. And they're trying to win over everybody else. I get the controversy, and I get the overgeneralization of the fact that, D&D at its core is let's get paid and kill monsters. And it's a fun trope to have the characters walk into town and all the people hate them. Because wherever these people go, that's where the monsters show up. We don't want you here. You're going to walk into town, and we know goblins are following. And so, you have the town that just hates all adventurers, and they ban them from existence, and they run them out of town as soon as they walk in. But I think it's just a style of play. It's how do you want to play the game? Do you want to be mercenaries? Great. Well, I will run a game for you where you're mercenaries. You want to be heroes? I will run the game where it's not about money, it's not about the treasure, it's about saving the town or the village or the world or whatever. And so I think that's where, as the person who's running the game, you talk to the players and you find out what kind of game they want to play, and then you run that kind of game for them. Or you offer them, here are the 3 things that I can run for you. what are you guys feeling like right now? What kind of campaign do you want to play in? But so are they the heroes? It depends on what day it is and what kind of game they want to play in. If they want to be heroes, I will make sure to run a game for them where they are going to be heroes. If they just want to get paid, I can run that game for them as well. I think the best kind of D&D is when it gets to be complex. It's when you get the players who have the differing goals, and that's why I think the best games of D&D that I've played are the ones where people have really thought about their characters. And this isn't just D&D, this is role-playing games in general. The best kind of role-playing game is when the people that I'm playing with have thought about their characters, take the time to get their minds in that mindset, forget who you are away from the table, but when you're sitting here, you are a different person and you're going to play as that person. It becomes so much more fun. And again, those are the moments that for me make role-playing games, here's the controversy, James, better than all the other games I play at a tabletop.
Well, I mean, you're wrong. But,
That's
not much argument I need for that.
This is what people.
Wrong.
This is what James needed for the controversy. It's that no. Tabletop role-playing games are better than board games.
Let's just ignore that. And, I kind of feel like what James was talking about is just a side effect of the leveling system. So it's just the nature of you want money to get geared, to get stronger, you want to progress. And you can make a philosophical argument, even if they're doing it without getting paid, they're still getting the reward for XP. So is it really being a hero if you're getting rewarded for it?
Well, also, if you kill more things, you get more experience.
Yeah.
But I feel is actually one of the limitations of Dungeons and Dragons is that it's buried in this paradigm, for lack of a better term, of, killing stuff is worth XP, getting treasure is worth XP, performing quests is worth XP, right? Which sort of puts things into a box when you're playing in Dungeons and Dragons. Only, if you tell a person that they're going to get the same amount of XP for resolving this encounter with the goblins without conflict as with conflict. In Dungeons and Dragons, they're probably just going to go for the conflict. But in a different kind of game, they might be like, let me think about that. How can I do this? Right? Because you presented both a choice and a challenge. Like, how do I pull this off without combat?
So that's also one of the nice things, whereas the DM does have that freedom to change how he wants to reward XP. So he can actually value playing in character more than actually killing something.
Well, not unless you have a rules lawyer there. Either way, point systems are a big thing. They're very addictive and they're very popular. So having levels for characters, like playing Pac-Man and getting to level whatever, is an extremely addictive thing, and it's actually translatable into most people. So having that level system, I think, increases the acceptance of D&D and appeal. So I'm about to argue that narratively wise, it creates some limitations, but it does get people to the table.
I would say that most, if not all, the RPGs that I have been exposed to do involve some form of character progression. D&D happens to have this form of character progression where characters do things, they earn XP, and when they reach a certain threshold of XP, they gain a level, and this level gives them more hit points and more powers and all this other stuff, right? There are other systems out there where the other stuff comes first, and then you get the level when you've accumulated enough other stuff. And there are other systems out there that don't have levels at all. There's just stuff, and your character is a pile of abilities, and there is no level. It's just your character is this list of abilities.
I'm curious how many GMs actually use the point system, because you have the option to do like story beat progression instead of point system, and I have never seen anybody actually using it, at least not on any like of the YouTube videos or Twitch videos I've seen.
I think a lot of people use the point-based system. I played a lot of some other, and they have, and I know that when we had that interview with Kaisi, they did that progression-based system, which I like. Eventually is point-based all the time, isn't it, Peter?
I've been playing D&D for 6 years, and the only time that I've done anything with XP, actual XP, is Adventure League, and now Adventure League doesn't do it anymore either.
Oh, really? Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, Adventure League is first tier. You play one 4-hour session, you level up to level 2. You play another 4-hour session, you level up to level 3. Eventually, tier 2, you have to play 2 4-hour sessions, and then you level up another one. And then 3 4-hour sessions, and you level up another one at the different tiers. No, my understanding with 5th edition is, yes, XP is there. It's listed in all, like, how much each monster is worth and how much, but I have seen probably no one actually use XP with 5th edition. That's just a lot. Yeah, it's not that it's not there. It is baked into the game, but that's where 5th edition very upfront says, this is up to you. You're the person running the game. Do you do this however you want? I play in a game regularly that does more of an adventure league kind of leveling, where it's, we play a session, then we level, or now we're at the point now where we're having to play 2 or 3 sessions before we level again. And then when I run at home, I usually run where it's more, where does it feel right story-wise that your character would level? I mean, did you just beat a boss character? Did you just complete a portion of the quest that you'd been trying to reach? Well, okay, you just completed that. Now it feels like it's a good time to level up again. Now, if you want consistency, if you have players who are like, no, I like to know exactly when this progression is going to take place, then maybe XP is the way to go. But there's a lot of variation at this point, but I do feel like the vast majority of people in games that I have seen are not using actual XP.
Yeah, I think that puts too much stress on the GM to figure out anyway too, and too much junk. Like, who cares? In the end, they're just looking for some sort of structure for them to level up. And if that's progression's another structure too. So
there's a lot of different ways to do the same thing. And however you want to play, there's a way to play.
But my way's right.
Of course, James.
I don't know what it is, but it's right. Whatever it is.
The closest thing I've heard is of people using that point system just kind of as a guideline of, how many monsters should I throw in an encounter to make it, make sense for them having leveled up, but not really strictly tracking it.
Well, it gets into it in the end, other than gaining new abilities. Are you really leveling up? Because, theoretically, the dungeon should become tougher to match the player. So narratively, it's the same. You just have more of an array and more things for the DM to worry about the higher the level they get. But in essence, you could theoretically have the same gameplay in a level 10 as a level 1 dungeon, where people could just as easily get wiped out. And there's no huge advantage to being a level 10 other than an array of junk you can do.
But it's so much cooler to fight a dragon versus a goblin.
It's true. You could, I guess, at level 1, you could fight an aging dragon that's on its last breath.
That's
why they still lose.
That's why they have dragon wormlings.
There you go. You just, yay, things I can squish.
Nathan's right. Level 1 party against a dragon that's taken like 90% of its health down. Dragon probably still wins that fight.
Yeah. I'm talking about one that's just like ready to kick the bucket right then and there. And you're like, okay, here we go. Oh, its tail hit you. You're dead.
It's got 1 HP left. It still wins.
Fighting a dragon's a lot better than fighting the goblin named Fred that might kick your butt.
I'm sorry, I forget which system that was. It might have been D&D 3.5 or one of the other ones. Maybe even 4th Ed was the first system to do that. What do you call it? You would have full strength enemies, right? So they would have all their special abilities, all their attacks, their full armor class, all that jazz. But they would have 1 hit point, and they would be called, I think they were called minions or something like that. So if you wanted players to feel pressure but also feel powerful, you'd throw like 30 minions at them. And against large numbers, the players are gonna take some hits, but they drop these minions with 1 successful hit. Don't even need to roll damage because they all have 1 hit point, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I think you guys are going to really like Symborum. You can be doing pretty interesting things, but yeah, you can run into things that you should not fight.
So I guess my question is, when you sit down to play a role-playing game, this is the question for everybody. What kind of game are you looking for? Are you looking for the fantasy hero? Are you looking for the gritty realistic? Are you looking for the horror themed? I mean, what is it? What is your ideal role-playing game? And have you found a system that does it for you?
I'll go first. I have not found a system that has done it for me. I have found a lot that I like. I like Symborum, but it's not quite there yet for me. When I play a RPG or even when I'm going to run one. I want it to be about the story. I want there to be an arc. I want there to be tension, and I want there to be cost. So I want there to be a real tangible world that is your decisions are very meaningful. If you make a poor decision, you get a bad response, or I mean, depending on the situation. So there's a lot of onus on doing things just not crazy. Like you're not going to be a murder hobo in the game. It doesn't make sense. You're not going to steal everything out of a room because it doesn't make sense. Like that shop owner is probably going to stab you or call a guard. So I like that's what I like in an RPG. If I going to play an RPG, I want it to be tension. I want there to be actual story that builds up throughout the session, and I want there to be consequences. If I mess up, I want there to be a real consequence. And I don't necessarily want it because of my dice roll, which is another thing that I get. A lot of the games that I play, I get away from. I play games that have very little to no dice rolling in them. And D&D is like all dice rolling.
Oh yes, no. If you want a game that the roll of the dice is not going to make the deciding factor for you, yeah, D&D's not the game. You know,
not necessarily all the time.
No, but
as much.
Yeah, D&D you roll dice. I mean, again, if you're sitting down to play D&D, you want to roll dice and kill monsters. If you're wanting the story and the decisions you make to affect the outcome and not rely on any level of real gambling, you don't want to roll the dice. So then, yeah, I'm with you. D&D's not the game that's going to do it for you for sure, because there's always the chance that you make the right decision, you take tactically the right steps on the battle mat if you're playing with a mat, and then you roll the dice and you fail miserably. And I'm with you. Like you're like, that's not the game I want. If I make the right decisions, I want the right outcome.
To a point. I mean, I do like dice rolling in combat, because realistically in combat, I mean, you could be the greatest sword fighter in the world and just get ran through the heart because you just made a slight mistake. I'd like it in the combat. I like it in certain situations. I just don't like the level of rolling that's in D&D. If I want to jump over a log, I can just jump over the dang log. I'm not going to do an agility test. I'm not going to see my guy is athletic. I'm good. I jumped on the log. Great.
Oh yeah. I was going to say, if I'm running D&D for you, I'm not making you roll dice to jump over a log unless you're jumping over a log in combat.
Yeah. So, I mean, that stuff can be okay. So when you're doing stuff like that, there's going to be chance. Like if I'm going to do something stupid, I should roll a die. Like if I'm going to be jumping from one cliff to another while I'm trying to hack off someone's head, yeah, I'm probably not going to pull that off, but let's try. So there's some dice rolling I like. I just don't like the level of dice rolling that can be in a D&D game.
Yeah, I know. I totally understand. I feel like in D&D there's, and again, I feel like a lot of it comes down to style of play and the style of the person who's running the game. But there is definitely, I feel like, more of an opportunity in D&D for just rolling a lot of dice. And again, that's one style of play.
There are games that do go the complete opposite and just like completely forgo dice. Fiasco is one of them, which is basically a prompt-based system. So it prompts you, and you're just telling a story.
Mm-hmm.
There is no failure or success. You're just simply continuing the story based on these prompts.
So, does anybody else have an answer like James had? Then, like, what is your RPG, and have you found the system for it?
I do have an answer to that question, but if you want to go first.
Okay, I have one I have not tried yet that approximates what I kind of want. There's a Blades in the Dark is one I've heard about that sounds very interesting. Basically, it's a ghost punk thing, so it's basically steampunk with ghosts powering the steampunk mechanisms. I'm not thrilled about the ghost stuff, but But the thing I like about it is, one, you not necessarily playing a good character. It's not an ideal world. It's a rough world. You kind of have to do bad things to survive. You have to be kind of a scoundrel. And it has a nice mechanism where you plan in flashbacks. So that avoids the DM having to describe everything in detail beforehand, and then you spend an hour planning, and then, the DM didn't describe this one element. I would have talked about that, and we would have prepped this for that if I'd known that existed. But the flashbacks avoid that by just saying, okay, when we come to this, okay, let's flash back. Beforehand, I did this, I brought this, I bribed this guard or did whatever. And, rather than like doing a normal leveling system, they have, I believe their way of leveling is downtime. So you use your downtime to maybe get a better doctor to help you heal better. You, spend time to, build things or, get new equipment.
I mean, that's one I've heard of, but I've not really looked into a whole lot. So it's interesting to know that, again, that's one that maybe you would be interested in trying out at some point, because like you said, it's maybe it's not the perfect game, but it's the closest to the game that for you right now feels the ideal. All right, Dan, you're up.
All right. I'm going to answer this question sort of in reverse. Have I found a system? Yes, absolutely. The system is Big Eyes, Small Mouth. This system is currently on its 4th edition, and I own all 4 editions. So Big Eye Small Mouth is an anime-themed role-playing game, which does seem weird. I admit. I like the system, however, a lot, because there are only 3 stats. It's basically mind, body, and spirit, and everything else you buy as like traits and or skills. The system is really flexible in terms of the like power sets that you can generate and like the special abilities that you can put on your character. So I like the system because it's very flexible and you can run it cross genre, across different like settings and time periods and tones. You could play with like abject horror or lighthearted comedy, and it will still work. In terms of what I am looking from a specific game, I don't think I have as detailed a response. I think I'm open to most experiences as long as we know what we're going into ahead of time. Like if we sit down and we talk about what we want out of a game, like James mentioned a couple things that he wants out of a game, I'd be like, yeah, I'm down for that. But if Nathan told me for whatever reason that he was like, I just want to kick down doors and kill things, I'd be like, okay, I could also be down for that, right? As long as I know what I'm going into.
Yeah, I'd also like to try Morkborg at some point, but that definitely, I'm pretty sure that cannot be aired on our channel because I don't think that's in any way family friendly. That is, sounds like it's intended to be brutal, ripping the skeletons out of people type deals.
We can, I could change the rating and we could put it up on YouTube.
Okay.
So we could do that. We could still do it. I think you wanted to run that one, right, Peter? We're thinking about that one.
I'm thinking about that one. I'll have to, again, look a little bit closer, but we'll see.
See, I delayed my Cyborium session mainly because my first one, which I'll tell you anyway, because I thought it was really cool, I decided to scrap because I'm not a very brave person. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to have the entire session where you guys were stuck in a armored covered wagon. And it would all be dialogue. And it had a conclusion at the end that I thought was really cool. But basically, you were all beaten and you wake up at different points inside this wagon. And you're not from the Devokar area. So you're getting transported. And the only other people that are in that wagon is a beaten up old man and a beaten child. So you have to work through and figure out what's happening through them. And then at the end, you would actually start your campaign.
See, that sounds really interesting to me.
I thought it'd be really cool. I had a whole storyline for it. I think it's really, really cool. That's why I might use it sometime because I think it's cool and I love.
Sounds like the beginning of Skyrim. You start at the end and the back end of a cart being carted off to get your head chopped off. There's people there, and
it sounds like it's got potential to me.
I think it'd be a lot of fun. Maybe I'll be brave enough to run it someday. Instead, I'm doing The Promised Land is the one you guys are going to be playing. So
okay.
But you need to have more courage. If you had more courage, you wouldn't be the cowardly betrayer in all the board games.
That's true too, because board games are better than RPGs.
Agreed.
Well, I mean, board games are a different thing.
Yeah. That they are,
and
inferior.
No. So, and I don't prescribe to that whole like I'm an RPG player, so I'm above board games, and I don't prescribe to that. I'm a board game player, so I'm above RPGs. It's just a different thing.
That's right. I love board games and I love RPGs.
Are 100% better than each other.
It's the group I'm sitting down with and what game we want to play. If we want to play an RPG tonight, awesome. If we want to sit down and play a heavy Euro, great. We want to sit down and play Unmatched, fantastic. As long as the group is down for it, I'm usually down for it. I love playing games.
So you basically are saying that it's all about the experiences and memories that playing these games
Kind of like I'm saying that. It is.
No, you went there.
Mic drop.
No, so I totally agree, and I will answer my own question now. I don't know that I've played a game that is my ideal RPG yet. I think probably I definitely lean towards I want a game that really is heavy on the story. I want to get lost in my character. I don't mind a bunch of dice rolling. I find it to be fun and enjoyable. If I screw up, that's fine. I can mold that into the story as well. I think there's this longing for me to like sit down with a bunch of other players who feel exactly the same as I do about RPGs. But that's a hard thing. It's hard to find a group where everybody wants the same thing from the same game. So there's always going to be a little bit of give and take with trying to play a little bit of the game I want, but also giving into playing the kind of game that you want as well. But that's playing games. That's the way it is. But I think a fun thing to try out is, trying games with different levels of players or different numbers of players. I've played probably one of my favorite sessions of D&D / role-playing game was just me sitting at a table with my 8-year-old nephew for 2 hours playing, because it could just be whatever the two of us wanted, and it's so much easier to mesh your desires when there's fewer people that you're meshing together. So if you've never played a role-playing game with just maybe one other person, I would recommend it. I think it's very interesting to try out, and I definitely think that there is such a thing as too many people at the table. It gets weighty. And it's so long. So I don't know. I don't know. Long way of saying I don't think I found my ideal game yet. I do love playing Dungeons and Dragons, but I have played other role-playing games that I've enjoyed just as much. And so that's why I look forward to continuing to find new games to play. And I cannot wait to play Symbaroum with James running. I think it's going to be fantastic.
It's going to be very story driven. I think you're going to love it.
I'm really looking forward to it.
And the only reason you haven't found the perfect one is because Eric M. Lang hasn't made it yet.
Interesting.
Although,
Eric Lang, are you planning RPGs out there?
Actually,
I know you listen to the podcast, Eric Lang.
I think Truvang Legends, didn't he create that or co-create it or take it over?
Did this seem on?
I have no idea. Idea.
That might be his first RPG if it is, but I think it was a different person. I know he showed it off a lot.
Trudvang Legends he is one of a group of designers for that, but it's not really.
That's pretty much an RPG.
This is a game that's not yet out yet, or
no?
out?
It's back to development. It's been going for 2 years. It's basically like an RPG that you have a board for and miniatures, and so it's more of an RPG than a board game, but it does have a board game components.
Okay.
So you are going through missions, you are going through a campaign, and you are adapting the board game to the results of what you do. You're sliding in different, like if you go through a session and you do X, you're going to slide that into that area, and that area is changed by that.
Okay.
Now, there's board game components to it, but it's pretty story driven, it seems like. I think that's why it's been in development forever.
Yeah, that is one that I'll be getting once Kickstarter fulfills it, as well as Osworn, which is kind of the same concept. It's definitely that one even more. So that is an RPG that they've board gameized. Board gameized, is that a word?
It is now.
Yes, made better. They took an RPG and they improved it by making it a board game.
Okay. Or, they improved board games by adding RPG to it. Whatever.
Potato. I'm not saying I'm more right, but I am.
So we've talked a lot about D&D for non-D, not wanting to talk about D&D in this podcast. And we talked a lot of games that are like D&D, but we haven't really touched on too many of the games that try to do things that D&D just simply can't do. Like the DM-less games. I have an example, which 1,000-Year-Old Vampire. It's in 1,000-Year-Old Vampire. It actually is DM-less, and it's actually intended to play solo. You could play it with more than one person if you wanted to. But in it, it's a prompt-based system. You're rolling a dice to see how many pages you progress in the system, in the book, to see what prompt you get. You can actually end up going backwards in the book, and if you end up on the same page, you read the next prompt. And it's not a randomized prompt like some of these other DM list systems, because you are progressing through the book, and you cannot possibly get to the later pages in the book early in the game. So in the later pages, you can have the writer of the book could actually have assumptions of how much far you've progressed and how long you've been playing this game. And it has an interesting system where since you're 1,000-year-old, you're gonna live for 1,000 years. You're recording memories and keeping a journal. So those memories you'll eventually forget if you don't record them in your journal. But your journal can get damaged. You could lose pages, and those things are things you've forgotten. And the fact that you've forgotten it could actually come back and haunt you.
While we're talking about really different RPG systems, I want to touch briefly on the entire universe that is LARP games. So live action role-playing games have to do everything that a tabletop role-playing game does: character generation, task resolution, scene resolution, but they have to do it without dice. Normally there's very minimalistic character sheets because people need to carry them around with them. And it leans heavily on the social interactions that players have in character.
Yes, but it's outside.
Not necessarily.
But it's normally outside and the sun's out.
It has to take place in a space. Whether or not that space is outside or in a convention hall, it takes space, yes.
But space doesn't have oxygen.
James is the worst, and we all know.
That was bad. That was so bad. I regret saying it, so I'm leaving it in the podcast.
Great.
Live with your regret. Ha ha ha.
Exactly.
And I've never played a LARP.
Yeah, I just, there's too much exercise and sun and stuff. I mean, no. I see how it could be a lot of fun, and I could see how it could be more of a engaging thing potentially, because you're literally doing this stuff. You're literally acting it out. It can be more immersive potentially. Ain't for me, but
it'd be very hard for me to just jump into LARPing. It's like, I definitely have to play a lot more at the table sessions and get more comfortable like role playing before I can really go into LARPing.
I would be a friar, because they would start moving. I'd be like, hold on, I gotta sit.
Oh, because friars are all fat?
Oh, at least I am. So, yeah, the true story. Anyway. No LARPing. No LARPing. Anyway,
how did we get on this? No one has an idea.
It's also exercise adjacent, so that's bad too.
There are other tabletop games out there that, like Nathan's example, use really different systems. I forget the name of it, but it's like this suspense style story that uses effectively a Jenga tower. Whenever someone there we go. Whenever someone has to make a test, they have to pull a piece out of the Jenga tower, and when the Jenga tower collapses, someone dies.
That's about right. That's how it is in real life.
So the tension is really palatable in that game.
There's also the Fate system, which is the Fate system's mildly popular too, and that's all narrative. Either succeed or you don't.
Yeah, there are other systems out there that use, instead of dice, they use like a almost like a bidding system. Vaguely, you could call Numenera one of these. Like in Numenera, you have like a stat or ability pool. You try to do something, it's difficulty 4. You need to spend 4 points from that stat in order to do that thing. You don't get those points back until you rest. Yeah,
and that's where they get into that open magic system, because the DM decides the difficulty of the thing you're describing, and you have to meet that. It's more free form, which is good and bad to that.
There's another game that's similar to Dread. It has a little bit more structure involved. It's called Icarus, How Great Civilizations Fall. Now, this is another DM-less system where basically you get prompts to how you're building your society. And at the end of this game, your society is going to fall. So you're kind of progressing towards that point. You have your own motivations that you're trying to fulfill. And as you tell elements of the story, you're rolling a dice to see if that is successful or fail. It's just black and white, succeed or fail. But if you fail, you put that dice in the center, and every time you fail, or anytime anybody fails, they add a dice on top of that. And you're basically building a tower in the center of the table, and once that tower falls, your society has crumbled, the game is over.
Also how real life works.
So reverse Jenga.
I'm gonna develop one that uses a Ouija board.
I think there might have been one.
Oh God, I hope not.
I think there might have been an RPG that used a Ouija board. Come to think of it,
like the dumbest idea ever. So dumb.
There were a lot of dumb ideas in the 80s. Let me just say.
Yeah. Yeah, I was looking up the list of RPGs. There's like thousands and thousands of them. And I've only heard of a dozen, so obviously majority of them are horrible. So let's go ahead and end this by mentioning one RPG that you haven't mentioned yet that you would like to try.
And is there a Magic the Gathering RPG?
Yeah, they made a skin for D&D.
Okay.
Is that your answer?
Apparently not.
I'll go ahead and just throw one out there that I've heard about that I think sounds very interesting and have yet had a chance to play it, but it is called Microscope. I don't know if any of you have heard of that one before or not. I'm looking at everybody's faces real quick. No, everybody's shaking their head no. Okay, so my understanding is, so it's by a guy named Ben Robbins, and it won some awards back when it came out in 2011, 2012 in there. And the idea is that you're creating a world by creating the history of the world as a group. It's meant for 2 to 4 players, I think is the idea. And so let's see here real quick. What is Microscope? Humanity spreads to the stars and forges a galactic civilization. Fledgling nations arise from the ruins of the empire. An ancient line of dragon kings dies out as magic fades from the realm. And these are just some examples of Microscope games. It says, do you want to explore an epic history of your own creation, hundreds of thousands of years long, all in an afternoon? And that's Microscopes. The idea is that you're sitting down with a group of people and you're creating instances of things that have happened in the span of this civilization, but you don't have to do it in chronological order. Somebody might write down, like, this is a thing that happened in the history of this world, but then they slot it in before somebody else's incident happened, and following the rules of the game, create the history of the world. My understanding then is that some people have taken this game, so that creatively as a group they create the world that then they play another game within. So it's like, play Microscope to create your setting for your D&D game. And then there's another game called Kingdom by Ben Robbins as well, which makes this much smaller. And again, it's creating the history of not your world, but the kingdom within your world. So there's Microscope, which is creating the history of an entire world or galaxy or whatever. Kingdom, creating the history of the kingdom within that world or a world. There's no dice rolling. There's pen and paper, and that's literally it. There's no GM. It's just sitting down and creating a world together. And I think that could be fun with the right group. And since it's a game that's even meant to be played with just 2 players, I have a friend who I'm definitely going to play this with at some point. We just have to pick a day and sit down and do it together. And I will report back to you guys and let you know if I thought it was fun. But to me, it sounds fun as somebody who likes to write, as somebody who likes to create. It's just story. And I think that could be fun. For some people, that's like, no, that sounds incredibly boring, I'm sure. But for me, that is one that I've heard about that I would really like to play at some point.
So mine is Asunder. I really, really want to play Asunder. I like the idea of pretty much everyone is, in essence, a green mage, and that's it. Like, you have a symbiotic relationship with the planet. There's Gaia in this thing. So you will use everything natural. You'll infuse with like natural magic. You will use like giant beasts, jawbones as your blade. You will be able to like grow vines and stuff, and you can augment your body with different things. You can turn animals into weapons. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. It's definitely a darker RPG because it's where they had this world where it's very peaceful. Now it's corrupted. So Gaia has been corrupted. So everything, when you're drawing your power from it, it's now all corrupt and you have to deal with that. So I think that'll be a really fun RPG to run.
That one sounds cool. Mine would be Feast of Legends, the Wendy's RPG.
That does look cool, actually. I read it. It does look cool.
That just looks dumb. It's silly.
But cool, because I want to be the Fry Lord.
No, you want to play the My Little Pony RPG, don't you?
That does exist.
Yes, I know.
And it does actually look pretty comprehensive. And no, I don't want to play it.
So many of the things I am interested in have already been mentioned. I'm vaguely interested in The Expanse. I don't really know much about it other than I watched the show and I enjoyed the show.
You don't know much about The Expanse?
The RPG?
Oh, the RPG. Well, it's The Expanse. The Expanse is amazing. So if
Yes,
anyone
the
hasn't
show is
watched,
amazing.
if you like sci-fi and you haven't watched The Expanse, you haven't lived yet. Especially since The Expanse is actually pretty darn realistic when they get into. They spent a lot of time trying to make everything realistic. So they spent a lot of time making everything realistic in the series. It even got down to where one of them does like a space jump from one shuttle to another, and it was realistic on what happens to a person in reality when they hit the vacuum of space. And it was really cool, and they showed everything on there. And it is possible to survive a short spacewalk without a suit.
I've
But
played
it
the
was a
board
really
game.
cool scene.
The board game is nice, though you have to be a Euro gamer to play it. It's not thematic at all.
Yeah, I heard that about the board game for it. But The Expanse RPG, I'd be totally up for playing that. I think that'd be great. It'd be a rough RPG because The Expanse is a rough universe. Yeah, I'd be up for that. I would definitely have to be a Marine though, a Mars Marine. So that's what it would be. I want one of the power suits. I'd be so much, that's awesome. You can take a lot with a power suit. But yeah, I don't know if Dan and Peter have seen The Expanse, but if you like sci-fi, you should watch The Expanse.
I have not watched it yet. It's on my list.
Yeah, it's good.
I haven't seen any, but
Yeah, I will say the first season's a little weird for me because I hate Westerns. Super hate Westerns. It even Firefly is hard for me because
Firefly.
It's a Western-y thing. But the first season and a half of maybe even to the second season of Expanse is pretty darn Western. But if you love Firefly, you're probably going to like The Expanse.
I loved Expanse, just starting with the first scene, just how realistic it was in the way that various elements were behaving in the zero gravity. And it's like, it just felt completely believable and real.
They spent an enormous amount of time making everything like scientifically accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned a lot about space and space travel that I didn't know before. And a lot of things that I thought were true, I learned through NASA and all the science they did that was completely wrong.
Well, as for myself, in addition to all the games that was just mentioned by all the other panel members, I would love to try, and this is a difficult one for me because there's actually a lot of games that I think I would be willing to try. I'm not sure how much I might enjoy them, though. You know what I mean? I want to try another game using Fantasy Flight's rules system. So Fantasy Flight developed a specialized die system of like successes and triumphs and difficulty and whatnot that they built for their Star Wars RPG. And I played that system as a one shot and would love to try it again. But I thought that the system, it's got a little bit of a barrier entry because you have to understand the dice and like the symbols that are on them because it does use custom dice. But once you grok that, it's a relatively quick resolution system and definitely levels itself to a more cinematic game style. And I would love to try that system in some other setting besides Star Wars as well. And I know that they use it for Legend of the Five Rings, but I don't think I want to dig into that. I'm familiar with that background setting because of the original version of that role-playing game and the fact that it did release as a supplement for Dungeons and Dragons at one point or time or another. But when I see a system or when I see a setting like that that's got a very deep history behind it, and Legend of the Five Rings has a huge history behind it, I'm kind of scared to get into it.
So that same system, they have it coined as the Genesis system, and they actually have a blank Genesis RPG that you can translate into anything at all. They also translated it into their own world that is Descent. I forget what it's called. Descent and Battle Lore and all that. Tyranoth, I think is the
Tyranoth, yeah.
Tyranoth. So there's a Tyranoth RPG. I'm not sure if it's the exact name, but there's a Tyranoth RPG also. And I think mainly you probably want to jump into the Genesis one. So you can just do whatever the heck you want. You basically make your own skin over it and you're good. And a lot of third-party people did. So you can use the Star Wars dice, but they also have Genesis dice that are just generic, but they have the same sort of thing going on them.
There's a couple games that I know are really popular that we haven't mentioned at all, and I'm sure people are screaming in the comments. The fact that we haven't mentioned games like Deadwood or Cyberpunk, we've mentioned them now. Can we move on?
There's just a lot of them, And,
Yeah,
you know, if
there's
we
a
didn't mention them, they don't matter.
Oh man, James, what are you doing
I'm
to us?
just trolling the entire time. Eventually, I'm going to get some guy in the comments be like, "You're wrong." I'm like, I know. I tried to get someone to put in something in the comments.
But yeah, there's just so many games that we couldn't possibly talk about all of them.
So
Yeah.
this was Jim's guide to RPGs. Everything I said was completely correct. Thank you for listening.
Jim's absolutely full of himself.
I am. I totally am.
Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback for us, feel free to visit us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or Board Game Geek Guild 2989, or our website at tabletopgamingguild.com. Don't forget to like, follow, and or subscribe. Tabletop Gaming Guild is a product of Tabletop Gaming Guild LLC. All rights reserved.